So we have 7 great presentations lined up. They are listed on the screen here. So the way we're going to do this is that each speaker will present for 10 minutes. In a couple of cases, we have dual speakers, so they will have 15 minutes. But we are on a somewhat of a tight time schedule this morning. So if you have any questions for the presenters, please go to Slido and ask or post your questions over there under the Q&A tab. And then I will keep an eye on the questions as they're coming in. Please just start your question by typing the name of the presenter that you wish to ask the question to. So hopefully after each presentation, we'll have a couple of minutes for those questions. So I will ask them on your behalf. And so with that, I think we will go ahead and get started with the first presentation, which is from the Agricultural Drainage Management Coalition. That'll be Keegan Kult and Charlie Schaefer that will be doing that. So go ahead, please.
All right, thanks, Yava. Yeah, so I'll be kicking things off for ADMC, and then I'll leave about 5 minutes for Charlie to give his vision of what ADMC is doing and what we need to do in the future to make this all a success. So next slide, Ben. The Ag Drainage Management Coalition, for those not familiar with us, we are an industry-led group that was formed, actually, as Jane covered it really nicely in her kickoff to this meeting, to complement what that Ag Drainage Management Systems Task Force was doing, to help provide that feedback once again on practical solutions. And so our goal is to really ramp up the efforts to get these conservation drainage practices on the ground. Go ahead. Our board, we have a volunteer board. These are the companies and organizations that are represented on the board. So you can see there we have the major tile manufacturers, the control structure makers, engineering groups, contracting organizations, all have representation on this board. The board really drove the work that ADMC had done in the past. They brought me on as executive director in the fall of 2018. So a lot of the work done prior to that was kind of behind the scenes to get things done. ADMC was part of 3 different technical standards that NRCS ended up writing through various SIG grants. ADMC supported that work. They also did a lot of trainings in the past. They certified over 130 TSPs to help write these drainage water management plans. But now, moving to the future, now that we have me on board, I guess we can be a little bit more active in the projects and the work that we do. So go ahead, Ben. Just to highlight on some of the 2020 activities, I'm going to spend a majority of my time talking about this Polk County Saturated Buffer Project. Maybe one of the outcomes for CDN would be to come up with a better name for this project. We're really excited about it. We haven't quite figured out how to tag it yet, but we're getting a lot of really positive feedback on the work that's been done on it so far. We've been hindered a little bit this year, like everybody else, with COVID for education and outreach, but we're trying to make it work. We have a few major conferences and things that we were planning. The Advanced Conservation Drainage Training, which Adrian will talk about later in this meeting in Illinois. Then in Minnesota, with one of our members, ISG, they have a forum each year where they're looking at ag drainage and the future of water quality in a workshop in Western Minnesota. Then, of course, the Conservation Drainage Network itself. So we're figuring out if we can have in-person meetings or if we're doing more meetings like this, live or not, but really trying to get out there and reach a wide audience. A relatively new project that came on board, and I'm glad Tim Rosen was able to make it online to this meeting, but it's the conservation collaboration in the Chesapeake Bay. So looking at getting drainage water management practices put in place in the Bay. Then also another NRCS funded RCPP project is the Iowa Systems Approach to Conservation Drainage. Go ahead, Ben. So talking about the Polk County Saturated Buffer Project, we were really trying to figure out, even in our breakout room, we discussed how do we get the SWCDs more involved. Well, this is something that we've been thinking about. Can an SWCD partner with a nonprofit group like ADMC to really put more effort into getting these practices in place? Those SWCDs are tasked with a lot. They have to deliver a lot of different programs. And so would it ease their burden to have a group like ADMC come in and provide some focus on a practice? And what does it look like once we actually do provide that focus and on a particular practice? Can we get those out at a meaningful scale? So we came together, we formed this partnership about 3 or 4 months ago. It was formalized, but our goal was to install a total of 25 saturated buffer sites within Polk County, and particularly within about 5 Huck 12 watersheds in the county within a year. And we kind of picked that number 25. We settled at that. We were hoping to shoot over, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, how we're doing. But 25, we felt like that was a good goal. In the state of Iowa, we have about 50 to 60 bioreactors and saturated buffers in place right now, and that's really with a lot of effort over the last 5 to 6 years. And so we thought, doing 25, increasing that by a third, would be a pretty impressive goal. How we're doing this, we wanted to prioritize sites. So the Polk SWCD had the Ag Conservation Planning Framework ran in these Huck 12 watersheds, and the Iowa Soybean Association actually did that modeling run for them. So we used that model output to identify potential saturated buffer sites. From that, we reached out to all the landowners and the farmers with those identified sites. One of the changes with this model that we worked with as far as delivering the conservation practices was to really try to get farmers and landowners to install more than one practice at a time, not just one saturated buffer, but as many as we could. We've all been to those field days where you're installing a practice and someone looks down that drainage ditch or the stream and they say, well, this is great, we treated this outlet, but what about those other 3 outlets that we can see draining in right now? What about those? So we're trying to improve upon that. Of course, we had to streamline the process for landowners to make this work. We have a lot of different funding sources. We don't want those landowners to worry about where all this is coming from. We kind of handle that on the back end for them. The next bullet, incentivizing the participation. This is the one we kind of had a little bit of a hang up on. We're actually providing a practice incentive payment through a different funding source. So for participating in the project, it's a $1,000 payment for each outlet treated. But really that came about to when we were doing the original meeting on this, we were thinking, well, how do we get up to scale? And somebody kind of joking around just threw out there, well, I bet we get a lot of people to sign up, but we could just pay them to do this. And the more we thought about it, the more we thought this makes sense to actually incentivize this, because we think it'll save us time and money on the back end with the number of sites that we're going to be getting out. And finally, how do we make this an attractive practice for drainage contractors to install? These one-offs, one saturated buffer that might cost $4,500 to install, really actually hurts the drainage contractor's business model for just the amount of overhead, the cost of mobilization to go out there and take a full day, day and a half just to install one of these. So we're actually going to bundle these bids together and try to make it a more meaningful project for them. Next slide. Yeah, so this is kind of a simple project planning process model here. 5 years ago, I might have laughed at this, but we really needed to put a lot of effort in how we were going to do this and put it together. So about this time last year is actually when we started coming together to initiate this project, to determine how feasible it would be, figuring out what type of budget we would need to do this. Once we did that, we thought we had a pretty good budget to work with, and we had a reasonable goal of these 25 sites. So we brought all the partners that were needed in. So not just Polk SWCD and ADMC, but the Polk County itself, NRCS, FSA, the Iowa Department of Ag Land Stewardship. We've had all upfront open conversations about this. We developed a timeline. We know that timeliness is very important when installing these practices versus when you reach out to a farmer to go out to do the site surveys. You need to get that done before, basically right now once the crops really start growing, just because then you're limited access to the field. And then when when our construction window is going to be. So we need to know that we have the plans in place before we hit those construction windows. Execution, this is the most important one, recruiting. We reached out with a letter to every landowner, but then we actually called every landowner as well. Sometimes that sounds simple, but I don't think that always happens in a lot of projects. So I think that's one of the keys to our successes here, that we were able to do that. The survey, the communication that's gone on between the different partners is unbelievable. To go out and do the number of sites that we're looking at required a lot of communication between actually neighboring county SWCDs with loan staff, and IDOLs actually loaned some of their technicians in neighboring counties to help do the survey work for this. Once again, all the communication needed for that. Hopefully this time next year, we'll be able to talk about the closeout of the project at the next CDN conference and talk about how successful we were at it. How do we replicate this process, and how do we record the efficiencies that were gained by doing it the way that we did? Next slide, please, Ben. So status. So as of right now, we've scoped out 105 tile outlets. So we've had really good success from the landowners and feedback. We were able to target some of the bigger landowners, and they kind of opened their fields to us and let us go look. Right now, we're working with 15 different landowners on this. There's 87 active sites. We've eliminated a handful of them due to small drainage areas, or the topography just wasn't quite right. So right now, we're looking at about 70 saturated buffers or managed buffers. They're not you can't just set it and forget it, unfortunately, on some of these sites. But if the farmer and landowners are willing to manage it, we think we can make it happen. Also, some of the sites we knew wouldn't work for saturated buffers, but they would work for bioreactors, and we actually have interest in that as well. So we're doing the kind of the final surveying stage, so I'm sure we'll whittle down these sites a little bit further, and we're figuring out how to put these bid packages together. All right, next slide. Very quickly, the Chesapeake Bay Conservation Collaboration. This is just a screenshot of Tim's website there at Shore Rivers. We're going to come in, provide some training to staff and farmers and contractors on the Chesapeake Bay on how these practices work, where to cite them, maybe some of the financial assistance that's available out there. So we're looking forward to doing that. Next slide. And then also another NRCS funded project, the RCPP, is the Iowa Systems Approach to Conservation Drainage. Once again, we're kind of training the trainers on this project. We're excited about, there's some new partners in it that haven't been included in some of these RCPPs in the past. Iowa LICA is going to be involved. The Iowa Drainage District Association is going to be involved with this, trying to deliver these conservation drainage practices, as well as ag retailers. And another one that I think is really important are the land managers. So some of the farm management companies that manage quite a few tracts. We're going to be working with them to get their landowners interested in putting in these structural practices. So next slide, Ben. With that, just how to interact with ADMC. We do have a mailing list. We put out a weekly electronic mailer with the latest news in conservation drainage. So if you're interested in signing up for that, just shoot me an email. Or if you just have any questions for me, shoot me an email. We do have an active Twitter account. Look for these workshops that will be coming online this summer. We'll probably post on the CDN these workshops. Shout out to the 75th annual SWCS International Conference coming up this summer. It'll also be online. So if you like this format, we'll be presenting there to give more updates on that Polk County project. I think it's $75 registration, so it's a pretty affordable conference. There's going to be a lot of great information about conservation drainage there. You can always become a member of ADMC or just simply visit our website. With that, I guess I'll leave a couple minutes for Charlie to say a few words.
We're not going to show them yet, but so you can just read them.
Yes. So one question, Keegan, was, do you see this framework spreading to other states?
That's what we're hoping. There's nothing extremely unique to Iowa about what's making this work. So we're kind of capturing what worked well and what didn't work so well, but really just the amount of communication that's needed between all these different funding agencies. So NRCS, FSA, the State Department of Ag, if they have money in place, and how do we make these different programs that are available work with each other, because they can. It just takes a little bit of work, or maybe a lot of bit of work on the back end. So we're hoping to replicate this model in other states.
Okay, great. I think that and then there's a second question, and that is for the project you're talking about at Polk County. Who is funding the design and install and the entire program, and who is doing the design work?
So there's a lot of people funding it. It's the answer to that. The design work, we actually have a really good relationship with the local NRCS office, and they have a soil tech that actually has job approval authority on outlets that are 8 inches or smaller. And they're doing a lot of the design work for us. If he's overwhelmed, we're going to go out to private engineering. IDOLs will help pay for the private engineering then. As far as funding the whole project, it's a combination of IDOLs. FSA funds going to be used through the CLEAR initiative to help pay for it. The Polk County itself is putting in quite a bit of money. There's a watershed management authority. And it's also Polk County in Iowa is where the Des Moines Metro, so the largest city, is. And so there's some funding coming from Des Moines itself to help pay for these practices because they realize the importance of putting these upstream of the city.
Great, excellent. Thanks, Keegan. And we just have 2 minutes before the next speaker, Charlie Schaefer. Were you able to connect, and do you want to share a few thoughts with the group? No, I was just wondering if you had any additional comments about the Ag Drainage Management Coalition. We just have 1 minute left. If you had a couple of comments to share.
1 minute, you bet. Appreciate what Keegan's done. I didn't have the benefit of hearing his presentation, but I've got a pretty good idea. We talked prior to. We're just happy to be involved with this group and appreciate the fact that you've invited Keegan to participate on the committee to help organize this. We think it's really important work. And in addition to water quality and quantity related issues, ADMC is looking hard at how we might work with agronomic benefits as well and move that forward to give producers a real reason to adopt these practices so they get the agronomic upside, risk reduction, and we get the environmental benefit too downstream for our communities. And so now we're looking with partners in ADMC and invite partners from the Conservation Drainage Network to help us kind of put together kind of an open, free to public platform for management recommendations, a decision support tool that could play into automation, but give us good, firm, science-based information so we know how to manage in any specific site location.
Next up, we have an update from the NRCS, or Natural Resources Conservation Service. It'll be Ruth Book, who is the State Conservation Engineer in Illinois, and Alan Gillespie, who is the new National Water Management Engineer. Excuse me. Go ahead.
Thanks, Yaba. That's first on my agenda, is to introduce our new National Water Management Engineer. You see his picture on this particular slide, and you'll actually get to hear from him a little later in this report. But let me give you his bio so you know a little bit about Alan. Alan Gillespie serves as the National Water Management Engineer for the NRCS Conservation Engineering Division in Washington, D.C. Alan's time in civil service started as a student trainee in Florida, continued as an area engineer, National Emergency Watershed Protection Program Manager, and most recently the State Conservation Engineer in Rhode Island. Alan graduated from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University with a Bachelor of Science in Biological Engineering and is a licensed professional engineer. This background and experience in providing conservation technical assistance to private landowners and agricultural stakeholders gave Alan a deep appreciation for how natural resource stewards can improve the quality of life for us all. So welcome to Alan. As you know, the National Water Management Engineer serves as the NRCS leader for conservation drainage practices, and you'll be getting to know him much better as we move forward. Let me give you a brief report as your liaison from NRCS before I turn it over to Alan. First up, and if you could go to the next slide, please, is an update on where we are with the drainage water recycling standard. As you recall, last year at this time, I had a little report from you, and NRCS and members of this very group collaborated to add criteria for drainage water recycling to an existing conservation practice standard that NRCS had. This was seen as a way to streamline bringing the concept of drainage water recycling into production much quicker if you can utilize an existing standard. And we recognize the similarities between recycling drainage water and recycling irrigation water. And so we moved those two concepts together in our new practice standard. It's been slightly renamed to irrigation and drainage tailwater recovery. Remember this code, 447. Remember, I drilled that into you last year. Do you remember it from last year? I bet you do. 447 will be our new national conservation practice standard that includes drainage water recycling. Back in October in 2019, that went to the Federal Register for public comments. This group did provide some comments, and this is part of that extensive review of all NRCS conservation practice standards, as you might recall, directed by the 2018 Farm Bill. The general strategy of this new standard is to refer to existing NRCS conservation practice standards for technical criteria related to the individual components of the drainage water recycling system. So this conservation practice standard 447 is essentially an umbrella standard, pulling it all together to support the drainage water recycling concept. The updated standard will become official very soon. We actually thought we'd see it in May. We have not seen it yet, but it should be very, very soon. And then let me remind you of the process. We went over this in some detail last year, but as you recall, states who already have this standard, so Conservation Practice Standard 447, in their Field Office Tech Guide, will have a year to update it accordingly, according to the new national standard. It is possible, given the volume, the high volume of standards that are going to need to be updated, that there may be more time granted. But by policy, each state has a year to respond to these updates. If a state doesn't currently have the standard in their Field Office Tech Guide, there is no requirement that it be added. Understand that adding a standard in a state is typically done by the State Technical Committee, which we also discussed last year. There needs to be a demand for the practice in the state because it's not something that you do lightly. In my position as state engineer, there needs to be a lot of work attached to bringing a new standard into the state to develop the guidance that is needed, the design tools, streamline operations so that when we go into production with this type of a new concept, we can do it in a reasonably timely fashion and not reinvent the wheel each time. And training is a big component. So we bring new standards in when needed. We don't just do it for the fun of it. Understand that. 3 of the 10 states I canvassed, and those I asked were the former AGWAM states. Do you remember that? AGWAM being our acronym for Ag Water Management, the effort that we kicked off in the 2011-2012 timeframe. States in the upper Midwest. And 3 out of those 10 states are hoping to adopt this new standard in time for fiscal year 2021 program delivery. That's coming right up. Fiscal year 2021 is October. And those 3 states are Illinois, that's my state, Minnesota, and Indiana. Now, they're not promising it will happen, but they're sure going to try and target that if the national standard can come out very soon. 2 others, North Dakota and Ohio, are looking at fiscal year 2022 or later. And the others are deliberating, let's put it that way. The State Technical Committee feedback is going to be very important. Moving on to a similar but different topic is conservation drainage payment scenarios. A lot of people are very interested in what NRCS financial assistance programs will pay. And so the payment scenario through the program, we like to pronounce our acronyms. EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentives Program, is all about getting conservation on the ground. The new scenarios I'll just mention to you are for drainage water recycling, for automated water control structures in several conservation drainage practices, including bioreactor and saturated buffer, and for recharging of bioreactors as they come to the end of their practice life. And understand then that NRCS develops payment scenarios nationally and also by region. I've got a picture of the NRCS regions here on this slide so you can see them. And each state has the option of which scenarios to offer for their program. So just because a scenario exists in one state is not a guarantee that it will be available for funding in another. Just understand that too. So remember the state technical committee. That's an important thing for you to remember. Go ahead and pass on to the next slide. I'm going to run through pretty quickly because I do want to give Alan a chance to say a few words. I've got some data harvested for you for the past 5 years of selected conservation drainage practices. The particular one on the screen here is drainage water management. You'll see I put 2 graphs. One is for how many projects and one is for how many acres. And notice that there has been a distinct decline in the number of projects involving drainage water management from 2016 until the partial year 2020. So, but that doesn't mean we're doing less acres necessarily. Notice how the acreage is different. So we're starting to work on some of the larger projects. The states who are top 3, I asked for data involving the top 3, are pretty much Mississippi, North Carolina, Ohio, in varying orders, although Michigan snuck in there in 2019. Understand that these data represent only what has been reported primarily through NRCS conservation programs and does not include the project, does not generally include the projects where NRCS helped design or be involved in the project but didn't go through one of our programs. So I'll say that these data can be lower than really got out there on the ground. Next slide, please. Here's the bioreactor. Two graphs are not needed here. It's just a number. How many bioreactors did we do? Look at 2018. That's our spotlight. That was the big year for bioreactors. Iowa has been really big in bioreactors, and notice that kind of follows along what Keegan has been doing, right? It takes partnerships to get these things on the ground, and so the help of ADMC and getting bioreactors implemented in Iowa has helped the numbers. I can tell you that there have been significantly more bioreactors built in Illinois than what is showing here, but that's because it's through partnership programs. Next slide, please. The saturated buffer is the final conservation drainage practice I'll highlight. We have on the left number of projects and on the right how many feet of saturated buffers. And you notice that the data don't even begin until 2018. That's the newer practice of the bunch. Iowa figures big. We have some in Maryland, some in Ohio. I will tell you that we, at least here in Illinois, are having difficulty finding sites that are suitable for the practice because of the heavy dependence on the properties of the soil. So that can be a barrier. Let me go ahead and turn this over now to Alan for his words of wisdom.
Thank you, Ruth. And thank you to the Conservation Drainage Network for the opportunity to join you all today. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Now, I'm a little biased, but I think the author of that African proverb had water conservation in mind. In service of our shared water conservation constituency, I'm very pleased to announce the development of the National Water Reuse Action Plan, also known as the RAP. As a federal employee, I cannot miss the opportunity to set up a new acronym. So the Water Reuse Action Plan is the RAP. Now, what is the RAP? The RAP is a collaborative effort across local, state, federal entities, and water users to advance consideration of water reuse. And the purpose is to ensure security, sustainability, and resilience of our national water bodies. The RAP identifies action leads, partners, implementation milestones, and target completion dates for 37 action items and 11 strategic themes. Within the theme of integrated watershed action, NRCS is leading the leveraging of USDA programs to encourage consideration and implementation of water reuse, especially within the agricultural sector, reuse and recycling. Within the theme of water information availability, NRCS is leading the action item of fostering USDA watershed scale projects that share water information. Now, this is a pretty in-depth document, and more information about it and the document as a whole can be found at www.epa.gov. In fulfillment of the latter action, NRCS is pleased to announce the activation of the Conservation Innovation Grant Program, CIG program. Many of you have heard of it. CIGs are competitive grants that drive public and private sector innovation that grow production and ultimately conserve natural resources as well. This year, we have a spotlight on water quality and water reuse. Within the water quality priority area, applicants can address one of several subcategories, including technologies or approaches that reduce the severity and extent of salinity through groundwater recharge management, irrigation water management, and drainage water management. Applications are being received until June 29th. Projects may be between 1 and 3 years in duration. The minimum award is $150,000 and the maximum is $2 million. And recipients must provide matching 1-to-1 to their request. Additional information on applying for the CIG is available at www.grants.gov. I'd like to thank you all for your partnership in conservation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan and Ruth. There is one question that came in on Slido for you, Ruth. It's from Isan Gane. And he's asking, will Michigan have the new scenario of equipped for automated control structures? And then when will these be implemented?
I don't know the answer to that, Hassan. The scenarios have not been finalized yet for states to even consider adopting, but I can sure ask my counterpart in Michigan to consider. I don't know if Michigan has the demand for that sort of thing. Remember that comment about the state technical committee. Make sure to participate if you haven't, and talk about this in their meetings.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. And then we had one other question that came in for Alan, also from Isan Gane. Acquiring the 1-to-1 match is very difficult for some applicants of CIG. Can there be a future scenario that CIG will require a lower match?
Yes, I was just saying that that's an obstacle that many applicants have run across. And as we look for opportunities to widen the field to more potential participants, that is one that I'll take to our leadership, that being reduction of the 50% match. So I thank you for that, and I will take that and forward that to our leadership.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Next up, we have an update from the Agricultural Research Service. It'll be from Teferi Tsegaye, who is the National Program Leader. That will provide an update. So please go ahead.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the organizers. I know I have a number of my colleagues are participating on this conference from ARS, including Kevin, Chad, Mark, Barry, Gary, John, Dennis, and Chua, and they can help in facilitating some of the discussion when it comes to the drainage and conservation topics. So I'll give you a brief highlight about ARS. Next slide, please. As you all know, ARS is the USDA, intramural scientific agency. We have about 1,800 PhD scientists, about 8,000 employees, approximately 700 research projects. Last year our budget was almost 1.3 billion. Next slide, please. This year our budget was increased slightly, and we have about 1.4 billion. And next slide, please. We have about ARS, we have about 90 US locations, and also in international, we have in Argentina, Australia, China, and France. So we have 5 area office: Southeast area, Northeast, Midwest, Plains area, and the Pacific West, as you see on the map. Next slide, please. When it comes to Office of National Program, we have 4 national program areas. One is nutrition, food safety, and quality. The second one is animal production and protection. The third one is crop production and protection. And the fourth one is natural resource and sustainable agricultural systems. The water availability, watershed management, national program 211 falls under natural resources and sustainable agricultural systems. Next slide, please. So when you think of water research and information, mainly our focus is research to understand processes and practices that control water availability and quality. And all of our data, including stewards for the SIP and other data, is housed at the National Ag Library, and it is accessible to the public. Next slide, please. So when it comes to our water availability and watershed management, National Program 211, this is our vision and the mission and the goal. The vision is integrated, effective, and safe water resource management. And again, the mission and goal, I am not going to read it, but we have our own mission and goal. Next slide, please. So we have been doing research, over a long time, but the last 5-year action plan started from 2017 to 2020. The project plans were certified in 2016, early 2017. We have close to 36 ARS-led projects, 299 cooperative research projects. The budget for the water availability area is 62 million, over 126 full-time scientists, and again, 27 locations are participating on water resource research. Next slide, please. As you can see, all the projects are highlighted here in each state. Some states have only 1 project, some states can have 4 or more projects. So within the National Program 211, we have 4 component areas. The first one is effective water management in agriculture. Second one is erosion, sedimentation, and water quality protection. The third one is enhancing and documenting the benefits of conservation practices. Fourth one is watershed management to improve ecosystem services in agricultural landscapes. These are the four component areas under this national program. Next slide, please. Under effective water management in agriculture, we have 6 problem areas. And as you can see, it is highlighted here. Drainage water management and control is in the first component area. There are, like I said, a number of our leaders, the research leaders, scientists are participating on this drainage and water management topic area. As I mentioned, Dr. Keegan Kult from Columbus, Ohio, he is a key person who is facilitating also and collaborating on this drainage network, and so are the others. And I am seeking Dr. Keegan Kult to take a note, and for this new action plan to help us guide our future research projects for ARS. So next slide, please. We have a number of accomplishments in the last 5 years. The first one is, in management of nitrogen and phosphorus loss from cranberry bogs. This research was conducted in Massachusetts, and this is our finding. Next slide, please. The second one is our colleagues also doing some ground penetrating radar integrated with the real-time kinematic global navigation satellites proved effective in mapping agricultural drains. Again, in this accomplishment, as you can see, you can track, and identify the drainage network. This is again in the Midwest. And the next one, please. This is a new project. My colleague, Dr. John Becker from St. Paul, he is probably Gary can highlight this in his presentation, or you can contact Gary Fyerson, who is participating. He can highlight. This is a new project in collaboration with USDA Foreign, FSA, and this is a starting. They just started, and this is going to be part of the LTAR, hopefully LTAR network activity, a working group, and this could bring a number of scientists to work on research addressing drainage. Under erosion sedimentation and water quality protection component area, we have 5 problem areas. These are the 5 problem areas. And then also enhancing and documenting the benefits of conservation practices. This is the other component area. We have 4 problem areas targeting research. And again, these are the problem areas. A number of locations are conducting research. The last one, I believe, is the watershed management to improve ecosystem services in agricultural landscapes. This is another component area. And we have also 4 problem areas we are addressing from the research point of view. Next slide. And then, as you all know, we have a number of watersheds that we conduct research on the SIP-related topics. And currently, we have about 16 watersheds that are monitored and conduct research. We recently added one in California and one in Vermont. So this is, basically the goal is to quantify and establish the scientific understanding of the effects of conservation practices at the watershed scale, and also to estimate conservation effects and benefits at regional and national scales. This is a collaboration between ARS and NRCS. In fact, we just released a special issue on 15 years research work under SIP, and the special issue was released last month. So if for some of you, if you are not familiar, you can get that as free. It's freely available to anyone who is interested. This is again a collective effort from ARS and NRCS joint publication. Next slide, please. So I'll close this talk. We are in the next 5-year cycle to develop our MP211 action plan, and I'll give you an update. And this is where I need, collective your support and a coordinated effort, through our leaders, like I mentioned, Kevin, Chad, Mark, Barry, Gary, John, Dennis, and Chiwa, and others also can contribute to our new action plan. Again, in the Midwest, wherever there is issues related to drainage, we need to identify what some hot topics that we can address in the next 5 years again. With this new cycle, we identified the panel chair, for a retrospective review, report review. The chair orientation is completed. Panel members were already identified for this new 5-year action plan. Accomplishment report is completed, and we just released the retrospective report for the panel, and panel member orientation will take place within the next 2 weeks, and the date is to be arranged. Again, it could be last week of June. And then once the panel receive the retrospective review, then they will review it and give us some feedback. It will be due to Oscar office, and the plannings, we are planning to have 5 listening sessions across the U.S. One will be in Beltsville, one will be in Mississippi, one will be in Oklahoma, one will be in Columbus or West Lafayette, Indiana. and the other one is going to be in Parlier, California. And also we are coordinating a listening session, during our SIP annual meeting, virtual meeting, which is going to be part of the Soil Water Conservation Society meeting. We're hoping to hear from some of our stakeholders, and hopefully we'll hear from some of you, what topics, we should address, what, innovative things we should add to our next 5-year action plan. So with that, I need your help, and I'm hoping, our leaders, the drainage and conservation research area include, like I said, I'm counting on Kevin King and others to capture some of the critical areas that is identified through this conference, and hopefully we'll implement those in our new 5-year action plan. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I will say building a better future through a collaborative and transdisciplinary agricultural research network and information sharing is critical for advancing the future of U.S. agriculture. Next slide, please. So if you want to contact me, this is my contact address. Again, I really appreciate, for inviting me to be part of this conference or meeting. Thank you so much. If you have any question, I'll be glad to answer. If not, my colleagues also can address some of the questions or topics that you raised. Thank you so much.
And prepare for the next presentation. That's an update from NIFA, or the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and it'll be the national program leader, Jim Dobrowolski, that'll be providing that update. Go ahead, please.
Thanks very much, Yaba. Good to hear from you. So, and thank you very much for inviting me. Today we're going to talk about the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and of course, I'm Jim Dobrowolski, the National Program Leader for Water. We're going to talk about some new twists for programming in water relevant to conservation drainage. Next slide, please. It's one of the things that I've noticed. I had a chance to look at a lot of your efforts to produce these excellent recorded talks and posters, and I learned a tremendous amount. And in fact, I'd like to write a blog about those and hope that they're going to stay up long enough so that we can get some information and get some folks to actually tune in to those because they were really fantastic. So congratulations on those. USDA NIFA is a small funding agency. We are the extramural funding agency for USDA with a big budget, about $1.7 billion, and about 90% of that is returned to you folks, to the states, to actually do the work. And so I'm going to have a little different talk because I don't do implementation of conservation drainage. I pay you folks to help us identify research, education, and extension that works to implement that activity. And part of that is through capacity funding, which is Hatch, Smith-Lever, the Renewable Extension Act, Hatch Multi-State, and in fact the NCERA 217, well, we fund that, and also competitive funding. So the AFRI foundational funding line is one of the ways that we fund conservation drainage through water quantity and quality, for example, through soil health and through agro ecosystems and the sustainability of those. And we also have mandatory funds outside of AFRI and other funds that are allocated to us from Congress. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about what we're thinking about. I'm going to give you a little look behind the curtain here as to what we're thinking in the next few years as far as what we're going to fund. And of course, I like Teferi. We are trying to get you folks to help us by providing some stakeholder input. So anytime that you have an idea and might want to share it with us as far as a priority, please send it along by email or what have you. So USDA NIFA's Institute for Bioenergy, Climate and Environment, that's where I live, IBCE. we envision shared goals for water that lead to sustainable, resilient agroecosystems, supporting healthy people and vibrant communities. We have to be subject, though, we have to map towards the U.S. Farm Bill, the USDA and NIFA strategic plans, but IBCE could, go ahead and next slide. You know, we could improve and develop innovative tools and practices to enhance decision-making to promote resilient agroecosystems, and there are several ways that we're thinking about doing that. One is by making precision ag more precise through the adoption of newly available technologies and synthesizing the work that we've already funded. So we already have funded like the NutriNet knowledge base for the synthesis of North American tile drainage research. We've done a lot of funding on-farm research for drainage water management to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus leaching, you know, trading off with climate change issues. And we are trying to help producers grow crops that benefit from irrigation in areas of the U.S. prone to drought and conservation drainage from areas with excess moisture or rapidly varying climates. Next slide, please. So we're also funding large long-term projects focused on regional and national issues with the availability of water. And availability, we're talking about both quantity and quality. To sustain productive, profitable ag and advance the knowledge needed to mitigate risk, or to restore some of the areas where we know we're going to have a reduction in our ability to irrigate agriculture. So going back and restoring those go-back lands and maybe changing the enterprise to support the rural communities that were there under irrigation. So by funding focused projects that support local water conservation that address antagonistic economics or use restrictions, because oftentimes we can develop great technologies and conservation practices, but we can't get them implemented or adopted because of antagonistic economics or because of water law, for example. Next. So we also are looking towards solving the salinity issue associated with long-term irrigation with non-traditional water sources, for example. You keep irrigating with recycled water, you're going to salinate the soil. So we have to solve that problem. We're also looking at trying to define soil health for locations suited to grow crops eaten fresh and relate the concept to long-term sustainable agriculture, and assisting producers and stakeholders to conjunctively manage groundwater and surface water, which still doesn't exist everywhere. Next slide. So one of the things that we're thinking about in the future is strengthening partnerships and collaborations. Right now, I'm trying to train NIFA staff to consider addressing private matching of public awards with a variety of partners, both for and nonprofit companies, international entities, other federal, state, and local agencies through MOUs, reimbursable agreements, and other mechanisms, and to promote more interagency collaboration with folks such as NSF. We have Infuse and the Signals in the Soil, or SITS, projects that we've been co-funding with NSF, or working with contests that US DOE is putting forth, or encouraging local workshops led by national program leaders and program specialists to bring inter and intra-agency colleagues together. Next slide. We also are going to push towards improving the understanding of interactions between the natural and social sciences to alter the bias across NIFA. By including a social, economic, policy, or human geography priority in every request for application. So we're thinking about doing that in the future. We're also highlighting the results of social research, in other words, survey work, and we want to require outreach professionals and help push them toward understanding the difference between information transfer and adoption behavior change, and to strengthen the linkage between our IBCE part of NIFA and the NIFA education programs. We have our own education in-house group, but the fact of the matter is the biophysical is not linked up well with the education. Next slide. And last we're also trying to improve the resiliency of managed systems by understanding that all systems are managed to some degree, to continue to request research, outreach, education that deals with mitigation and adaptation of natural resources in ag and widely varying climates, and knowing enough about how drought or excess moisture triggers are negotiated and how they're backed by science. And then predicting resiliency across fields, watersheds, and landscapes. So doing it at the appropriate scale. Next slide. And lastly, we're trying to prepare universities and others to better formulate these things we call transdisciplinary research, outreach, and education by properly conceptualizing interdisciplinary research involving scientific and non-scientific sources to meet the complex challenges of society, and by making transdisciplinary research a familiar activity of students, your grad students, before they are forced to risk all as faculty when they write up proposals. Writing a proposal takes a long time. It's a lot of effort, and we want everybody to be able to be successful in getting these transdisciplinary pieces of work together and be funded. Next slide. Lastly, thanks. Thanks for inviting me. This is my contact information. I used to be in Washington, D.C., and now I am in Kansas City, Missouri. Right now, I'm actually in Virginia because our office is closed, but there's my email and my phone number. So thanks, Yab, and thanks to everyone for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Jim. That was very useful and very informative. There is one question on Slido for you, Jim. That's from Jeff Frey. And he's asking, how would you see the NIFA components fitting with the conservation drainage network one-stop shopping for conservation drainage?
Yeah, I think what we need to do is maintain a really solid communication link between the EDN and NIFA, so that when we do fund or when we do complete projects that are relevant, that you actually get the word, that you understand where those are coming from, what they actually produced, and what have you. And the flip side of that is that we want you to particularly talk to us and give us some advice as far as the priorities that you want to see in the NIFA funding lines. You know, what part of the drainage picture is most relevant and most important at the present moment?
We will hear from Kathy Boomer, who is the Scientific Program Director at the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research of FAR. So go ahead, Kathy, please.
Hi, good morning, all. I am so excited and grateful for the opportunity to be a part of this meeting and to pitch an idea for how we can bring research funds and resources to this group. This has been a priority for us, at least since I came on board at FAR last year, and has really come a long way since a workshop we held in January, one that Jane helped us organize to explore the linkages between both watershed and soil health and agricultural water management. So before I dive into the details of the pitch we're making and finish up with a timeline for the group to consider, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Lauren Hershey, who is a member of our development team. That means FAR has resources to help bring in those non-federal partners, funders, who can help support the research. And then just to start by sharing a little bit more about who FAR is and our role in promoting agricultural research. So FAR is a nonprofit dedicated to building unique partnerships to support innovative science addressing today's food and agricultural challenges. Next slide. We have 6 challenge areas that I like to think roughly parallel the food chain. So my challenge area is sustainable water management. We also have challenge areas in soil health, next generation crops, advanced animal systems, health and agricultural nexus, and urban food systems. So we are a nonprofit that's funded by the Farm Bill. So we were renewed in the last Farm Bill for another 5-year period, and our charge again is to develop public-private partnerships to address the innovative science. Similar to many of the other grant programs, every dollar that we invest in that research has to be matched by a non-federal partner. Another subtle but very important requirement of our work is that we have to fund research that complements and doesn't duplicate existing federal research priorities. So that's why we work really hard to think about what are those missing information gaps and where can we help really move the needle in terms of bringing science to our stakeholders. Next slide. So there's 4 ways that FAR typically can provide funds. We have annual open competitive grants. Most of you might know about Seeding Solutions and our New Innovators grant programs. We also can do direct awards. We have prize announcements. And then the 4th mechanism is through consortia, which I think is the most exciting in terms of tackling big questions that we know no one project can answer alone. Those projects that require cross-project integration, transdisciplinary integration, and also a commitment to building upon the historical databases and knowledge that has been gained historically. The consortia is a way, I think, an attractive way to think about alleviating that one-to-one match that PIs often face when they're submitting grant applications to the more familiar grant programs. So with that, next slide, please. I'll jump right into where we are currently based on that workshop. And why I was so excited to come today is we'd like to work with you all in developing a consortium that could bring research funds that would facilitate cross-disciplinary multi-institutional collaborations, ultimately inform the designs and implementations of conservation water management. And by bringing in private industry, have a direct conduit to increasing the adoption of these advanced practices. I think what's really exciting about the workshop outcomes is it really emphasized one of the gaps that clearly emerged is there's a strong conceptual basis for thinking about the importance of water table groundwater management to soil health, but no direct evidence or explicit or limited direct evidence connecting those two in a way that can inform and advance drainage management. And this just really reinforced Mark Tomer's kind of drumbeating to recognize soil health management as kind of the base layer, the fundamental layer for improved watershed management. Next slide, please. So just to dig in a little bit more deeply about some of the outcomes from the workshop, there was a strong emphasis on needing a better understanding of the geography of drainage management, being able to provide place-based water table management or groundwater management prescriptions, generating technology that combines modeling and remote sensing to inform the operations of the innovative field equipment that's coming online, especially with kind of the innovative water control mechanisms. And then thirdly, to understand the farmer concerns enough to better understand how we can help them make decisions about optimizing practices and again, increasing best management practice adoption. We can dig down a little bit even more deeply and highlight that at this meeting, we had soil microbiologists, soil physicists, field hydrologists, and watershed modelers. And from a very technical perspective, there is a lot of discussion about the need to understand how the interaction between groundwater and atmospheric drivers affects soil moisture, and in turn influences the distribution of the soil microbes and its microbial function across our fields in different locations of a watershed. And that understanding these interconnections is what is really essential to thinking about how we can better manage those systems. So I hopefully created kind of a vision for where and how far I would like to help direct the research in a way that we believe will fit and complement the existing grant resources and objectives also of the Conservation Drainage Network. So with that, I'd like to introduce Lauren, who can speak a little bit more to the development side and what that would take in terms of bringing FAR to the table and investing in this network more directly.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kathy. So as Kathy explained, the consortium is one of the mechanisms that FAR uses to distribute funds through building public-private partnerships. FAR has 6 consortia currently, and no 2 are the same, so each has its own rules of governance. There's no template for building one. Consortia can have a mixture of industry and academia participation. Some are more led or heavy on industry over academia, but the goal really is to bring that industry funds to the table. So as the purpose of a consortium is to bring diverse groups together in the pre-competitive space. And as we know, research and development can be financially risky. FAR establishes consortia to pool resources together and unique knowledge and expertise of those diverse groups to fund that research. The results are then distributed to the consortium participants for use by their individual institutions, which is one of the primary benefits of membership. So ultimately, the consortium model allows participants to collectively explore the multiple areas of research based on common need while minimizing risk and cost. So this slide really shares on the left-hand side what's less difficult, so really the benefits that draw groups in. So those shared objectives and commitment to collaboration and sharing that cost, as well as the ideas for the pre-competitive space and support for open access to the research results, as I explained earlier. As well, there's a transparent value proposition for each partner that's involved in that partnership through the consortium. What can be more challenging, on the other hand, is establishing the structure of that partnership, which is created through the rules of governance that the group brings together, as well as agreeing upon data ownership, IP policies, how to release results, and then again, always competing interests and managing risks.
Thanks, Lauren. So we kind of raced through how we came to this meeting and what we wanted to share, and now we'd like to present the next steps and get your feedback about bringing FAR resources to the Conservation Drainage Network. We've laid out a proposed timeline. What really needs to happen next is a response from the Conservation Drainage Network about your interest level and willingness to commit to bringing partners to the table. And just to be upfront, when we speak about bringing partners to the table, we're talking about bringing the matching funds that are needed to bring FAR investment in. So what we'd like to do is over the next couple of months, work with the CDN leadership and the entire membership and thinking about who has capacity to come to the table and to think about then what would be the scope of a FAR facilitated partnership. Once we define who those partners are, we would have a virtual workshop where we could think more carefully about how to formalize the consortium. What are the requirements? How do we operate? How do we think about distributing those funds, awarding those funds to the research priorities within CDN? And then hopefully the sprint would be to kind of finalize that partnership by the end of the year and begin advancing that research in 2021. So that's our proposal. Next slide. And we're excited to hear everyone's response and to answer any questions that we can in the short amount of time that we have. Looking forward to follow-up conversations.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much, Kathy and Lauren. And I just want to mention, I should have mentioned this up front, that Lauren, the second speaker, was added to this presentation after we had finalized the agenda. So we did give Kathy and Lauren an additional 5 minutes just so that they had the same amount of time as other presentations where we had two presenters. There's still a minute or two, so if there are any questions, please go ahead and add them or ask them in Slido. Currently there are none. Otherwise, if there's anyone that just joined here recently, I do want to say that we're right now listening to presentations from industry and agency leaders related to conservation drainage implementation. So we just had one question that popped in from Jane Frankenberger, and she's asking, what a tremendous opportunity. Is it the development of a competitive proposal that will be evaluated, and who evaluates? Thanks.
So the evaluation is really done by the executive leadership or the steering committee of that consortium. So that would be voted upon by all members equally.
Yeah, just and to build on that, the consortium proposal would not be a competition within FAR, although the proposal would have to be evaluated and approved by our Science Advisory Committee and also our Board Advisory Committee. But I can tell you they're already excited about this topic and opportunity. We've been pushing the need for this research. In fact, we had a great discussion at our last board meeting, and so there's a lot of great forward momentum. And I hope you all are as excited as we are.
We will move on in with the agenda, and next up is Katie Flahive from the US EPA. As I recall, Katie is the co-lead for the hypoxia task force. But I'll let Katie introduce herself. Go ahead, please.
All right, thank you. And I just want to say a big thanks to all the organizers of this meeting for putting this on in such an effective manner. This is one of my favorite meetings to get to each year because I learned so much. This has already proven this morning to be a really effective forum for this community to get together this year. So just a big thank you to everybody who put so much work into pulling us together like this. I want to give a shout out to the folks that I'm going to be talking about some of the work that I'm collaborating with on. I have talked about the Hypoxia Task Force in this forum in the past. So I'm going to take off my EPA hat and put on my Hypoxia Task Force co-chair of the coordinating committee, and I see that my co-chair, Matt Lechtenberg from Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, is on the call as well today. And we're joined by Max Pothoff as well, who's going to say a couple of words during this. And I also note on here John Matthews from Ohio EPA and Angelina Freeman from Louisiana. The work that went into just the short presentation really is contributed by all of the members of the Hypoxia Task Force, which are the 12, they are 12 states, the 10 Mississippi River main stem states, as well as Indiana and Ohio on the Ohio River, and then 5 federal agencies. So if anybody has questions about the Hypoxia Task Force in general, feel free to follow up with me afterwards, but I'm not going to talk about that today. Today we're going to talk about a couple of work groups that have formed and the work that's moving forward in by these work groups. So next slide, please. Okay, I want to give a little background on these new Hypoxia Task Force working groups today. There have been many work groups stood up over the years that this collaboration has been in existence. Some have sunsetted when their work has come to completion, and some are continuing. So in addition to the work groups that have just been stood up and are mentioned here, The hypoxia task force also has a point source working group, a non-point source working group, and those two working groups focus on being able to illuminate the metrics from those perspectives across the basin and have published a series of reports that are on our website. And there's also a water quality trends work group working to identify big picture water quality trends across the basin. And those three work groups are currently active. But at the recent Hypoxia Task Force February meeting earlier this year, a discussion continued between the state and federal members. States have identified challenges to the Federal Water Subcabinet. The Federal Water Subcabinet is an organization of high-level water leadership from a number of federal agencies, including EPA, USDA, the Department of Interior, the Army Corps of Engineers, NOAA, and the Department of Energy. And the states on the Hypoxia Task Force have identified a number of challenges to that Federal Water Subcabinet. And as a next step, we had a discussion at the task force meeting as to how the federal agencies can collaboratively work collectively to help make some of the changes that the states have identified as needs. And so as a next step, the Hypoxia Task Force stood up this variety of 7 different work groups to consider major challenges that could be considered in some states, if not all the states, to be holding back or hindering some of their opportunities in implementing their nutrient reduction strategies that I think Yaba mentioned earlier this morning. So these work groups that have stood up are a mix of federal, state, and land-grant university membership and leadership, and the issues that they are considering vary. The work groups are listed. We're going to talk specifically today about the ecosystem social metrics work group, the adoption of innovative BMPs, and the monitoring work group. Next slide, please. From the perspective of the adoption of innovative BMPs work group, and John Matthews from Ohio EPA is leading this work group. We have a limited EPA involvement in this, but some of the major challenges that this work group is looking to help solve are how to get a better understanding of the process within each of the individual states for adapting practices and turning them into, adapting NRCS conservation practices to site-specific conditions in those states. And also better understand the state technical committee process in order to make those NRCS conservation practice standards available in each state. And I'll just have to note that I think the presentation we heard this morning from you, Ruth, was really invaluable to this conversation, and I look forward to being able to share some of that with John Matthews as he moves this work group forward. But there's a couple of different ways that states can go about implementing a new conservation practice. There can be a unique vision for a practice, and Keegan, you mentioned earlier today saturated buffers. This is a practice that has moved through the process to become a new practice. Some of the implementation of existing practices, I've recently learned about oxbows in Iowa, and then again, drainage water recycling, where these are new ideas for implementation in the landscape, but can be done through existing NRCS conservation practices. And then there's some practice ideas that are out there that are somewhere in between, like cascading waterways, which is the picture you see on the screen here. And this is an implemented example in Ohio, where this is not yet a conservation practice standard that can be easily implemented through the current policies. Next slide, please. So we've begun to develop the schematic, and it definitely does not cover all of the challenges or all of the points of engagement in the development of a new conservation practice. And I'll also just note that this is not independently applicable just to the NRCS conservation practice standards. some states have conservation support programs that provide funding for conservation practices, and the state very well may have in that third line their own independent process for bringing an implementation of a practice into being able to be supported by that state program. So you can move that engagement with USDA, or you can replace that with any number of other organizations. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn it over to Max to mention the work that he's helping lead.
Thanks, Katie. Hi, everyone. My name is Max, and I'm an ORISE research participant at EPA supporting the Hypoxia Task Force, particularly the work groups that were formed that Katie mentioned at the February 2020 meeting in DC. I also co-lead the Ecosystem Social Metrics work group along with Angelina Freeman from Louisiana, and we're composed of state Hypoxia Task Force members, federal agencies, and land-grant university members of Sarah 46. So this work group was one of the 7 formed at the meeting and is animated by the question of how to identify in-basin metrics of success in the Mississippi River Basin beyond the size of the hypoxic zone. So really to highlight successes that are happening. Next slide, please. So to get closer to answering this question, we see our group as being composed of 3 interconnected parts: the pursuit of social, economic, and ecosystem indicators that help illuminate changes in the Mississippi River Basin. So we spent spring thinking through social indicators, particularly how the social indicator planning and evaluation system might be applied to our charge. We're hosting our 4th meeting this week where we'll focus on various economic frameworks, particularly those that focus on assessing and valuing water quality services. And we've also had conversations about how we might pursue carbon tracking as it relates to these other 2 categories, potentially using existing tools like USDA's COMET. We're working in conjunction with the non-point source measures work group under the Hypoxia Task Force that Katie mentioned, with the intention of adding our additional metrics into their work to be presented in September. So on the whole, this group is really an opportunity to take a holistic approach, and our work today has reflected that, as you can see, as they overlap. So with that, I'll pass it back for an update on the water quality monitoring work group.
Okay, thanks, Max. So next, yeah, perfect, thanks. So another work group that was recently formed is the Water Quality Monitoring Work Group, and this is being led by USGS, Casey Lee at USGS, and Trevor Sample out of Illinois EPA. And the considerations that this work group is going through is looking to identify opportunities to strategically coordinate interagency monitoring in the Mississippi River Basin so that we can provide better insight to the public on whether these nutrient reduction progress actions are happening and working in support of the Hypoxia Task Force goals. So one of the actions that this work group is undertaking right now is to complete an inventory of monitoring sites and stations and assets, including stream gauges, stations with robust data sets of discrete nutrient samples, and continuously monitoring samples. And we are doing that with data in the Water Quality Exchange. So can you go to the next slide, please?
She was highlighting the Hypoxia Task Force newsletter, which is a quarterly email that highlights current information. The link is there under HTF updates. And also EPA has published a notice of intent for FY21 national priorities, request for applications. And so any questions about that, the link is provided, and we'll be happy to follow up there as well.
So next up is an update from the U.S. Geological Survey, and we will hear from Jeff Frey, who is the Deputy Director of the Water Science Center covering Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana. So go ahead, Jeff.
We are the research arm of the Department of Interior. We do not have any regulatory aspects of that. And a couple things to highlight is that we have recently gone through both a reorganization of USGS as well as the Department of Interior. And while that has some implications for us, some of the highlights of that is that we're hoping to streamline research from national efforts down to the water science centers and ecological centers throughout the country. One of the things that has happened with this reorganization is that the National Water Quality Assessment Program, which was one of our bigger national assessments, is going away after 30 years. A lot of what they did with trends work, understanding studies, are going to continue under a different part of the organization moving forward. And so one of the things that we're really pushing forward is 4 new program priorities. If we go to the next slide. So building up from the bottom, these new priorities include our National Water Information System modernization. It's long overdue, and with all the new technology out there with continuous monitoring and other things, we needed ways to put that into the databases. So there'll be a big modernization there. Another part will be building on both the national monitoring of groundwater and surface water, and that's called the Next Generation Water Observing System. This is going to be something that looks also at adding innovation to some of the monitoring that we are doing. And I'll give you an example of that in a second. The third part of the program is a water prediction work program, and that is going to be used to support daily to decadal forecast-based management of water supplies and infrastructure at regional and national expense. And then finally, the fourth one is the integrated water availability assessments. The IWAS is going to be used to evaluate water availability in terms of the spatial and temporal distribution of water quantity and quality into the surface water and groundwater. Next up. One thing to add on this with these 4 program changes is that we're trying to build in collaboration through each of these different levels. And so, for example, here with the Next Generation Observing System, this is broken down into pilot projects. There's going to be 8 more, but this first one is in the Delaware River Basin. And what you can see here is the existing networks of steam gauges. It does not show our groundwater network or soil moisture or other things that we're monitoring. But you can see that with the purple and the green with dots, there's been a large improvement in the spatial coverage of this. There's an assessment going into each of these regional studies as far as where we're lacking the monitoring capabilities. We also reach out with all of our partners within these states to try to enhance that and make sure that we're covering all the key places for adding this monitoring. Next up. All right, and so I guess what I'd like to do now is just sort of highlight USGS, some of the products and tools that are out there that might be helpful to other groups and organizations. Our reports are both done in journals as well as our own report system. And we have a lot of research out there on best management practices and engaging the effectiveness of those. So I'm highlighting a couple here that were done in the upper Mississippi River Basin on the left. We've also done some work on delineating tile drains and how that might have affected water quality at one of our Great Lakes Resource Initiative sites in Indiana. Barry Allred was also a collaborator on that. And the last is some spot models that were done for those same GLRI edge of field studies. And you can get a copy of these, you can just go to the link that's on the bottom of each of these pages. Another big part of the USGS is looking at trends. We've been sampling for a long time nationwide, and then using this data then to take a look at what are the trends in nutrients or pesticides. Also then taking a look at what are some of the response variables that can account for those changes, whether it's stream flow, changes in land use, things like that. So again, here's some examples of some reports that are out there that you can get access to. One of the things that we do internally is circulars, and these are parts of our understanding components, and these were all NAQA-based reports. These are geared more for the lay reader, the legislators, general public. And there's a lot more graphics, and it's more simple to understand. but it's I think one of our better publications that we do. And we've had some things that have come out on nutrients, agriculture, and the hydrology and how that can affect it in the middle there, and also some of the nutrient response, biological response and safe in ag areas on the left. So these are some ones that also I think we found of interest. And I think many of you have heard this is a tool, an online tool that I think is very helpful. This is part of the SPARROW, or the Spatially Referenced Regression on Watershed Attributes. This was updated in 2012, and it's got an online component so that you can take a look at it watershed by watershed as far as what the components, the load, the yields are, depending on whether it's nitrogen, phosphorus. You can also look at suspended sediment, stream flow, a very useful tool, and that's, the link is there on the bottom. Next up. And with that, all those things can be found on our USGS Pubs warehouse. So if you go to the bottom link there, whether it's in a journal or whether it's a USGS, we will have links that you can easily access any of those articles. And with that, I'll try to keep it short and sweet. Entertain questions.
Great, thanks, Jeff. That was very informative. We do have one question, and that's from Xinhua Ji, asking where can you get this? Where can you get SPARROW? So I assume is there a link to where the SPARROW output is? I assume is what the question.
If you go back to that slide, right, one before that, the link is right on the bottom. And that is the latest, these are national models. So this one is based off of 2012 data. They are updated periodically over time to make sure that we're getting the best land use and other variables nationwide.
Great, thanks. I mean, we just let this slide sit for a moment if anyone is taking down the URL for that. Oh, and Ben just put it in the chat as well, so you can grab it from there. Are there any other questions for Jeff? Please go ahead and ask them in Slido.